Hi, welcome to your Career Toolkit with me, Pira, and in today's video we're going to do a deep dive into a book that I've been reading. I want to start off this series where I'm reading interesting books and sharing my understanding of those books and what I find is useful, in the hopes that you would go and seek the knowledge out yourself and find interesting in the books that I read and recommend. Also to start some discourse around things that we agree or disagree with when reading, because I think it's a dying art form, but actually science has shown that when you want to have a deeper understanding of a topic, actually spending a few hours reading a book or an article about said topic is actually one of the most useful ways, but actually having in-depth knowledge about said topic. In a world where we're doing a lot of short content and we're not able to retain this information, it's super important that the art of reading carried on. So hence I'm doing this video. This series I am starting off with Emma Greed's Start With Yourself. It is a hugely interesting book. I have been a fan of Emma since her early days of appearing on Keeping Up with the Kardashians. She's gone on to do some remarkable things. She's had a talent agency and then now co-owner and CEO of some of the hottest brands on the market at the moment, whether that be Skims or Good America. And she does a whole host of other investments through the Shark Tank. So I really wanted to do a deep dive into her book because she's a fellow East Londoner, and if there's anything you know about East Londoners, we stick together and we like to support, and she's done so incredibly well. She was born and brought up not too far from me, and so it's always interesting to see a local girl done good, as we'd say in the UK. And the other thing that I love about an East Londoner is that they're not afraid to have an uncomfortable conversation. They aren't afraid to be wrong. They're always willing to be challenged, and there are things in the book that I think just needs a bit of nuance around them. And I think some of the controversy around some of the comments she's made is a bit of a misrepresentation about some of the wider conversations she's been having for a very long time. What I actually find is Emma's great in an interview format because she's able to give really good, long and nuanced answers. But when you start clipping them, or when you're seeing something in a static format like a book, you're not able to have that level of nuance. So let's dive in. One of the main themes of this book is around tenacity, and you see that throughout Emma's career. She started off on a paper round, and like all great entrepreneurs, she built on that skill set as she worked in a sandwich bar, and then she worked her way into an internship. She had her heart set on an industry and then she made it happen. What's amazing about Emma's story is something that we talk about a lot in this career, is saying yes to an opportunity, even if it's not your dream opportunity. She makes no bones about the fact that she does things that are still boring to her and that are repetitive. And actually a lot of her job is the glamorous side, which is dealing with a series of problems. What I really like about this is the honesty in which Emma addresses the fact that there's no such thing as a dream job, that you like your job or love your jobs. What she is really able to portray is that you spend a lot of your time at work. I think a third of it, she says, not very much enjoying it, the other third liking it, and then there's another third of it which you love. And actually she says there's a lot of her work that she really loves and enjoys, but she has to outsource it out, and she spends her time doing things that only she can tackle, and everything else she outsources. So what this shows is that even if it's your first job or you're in your early part of your career, you're not going to enjoy a considerable amount of work that you do and a considerable amount of admin that you do. I spend a lot of time reporting on the work that I do, not just doing it in my day-to-day as a management consultant, and I find that really laborious. I think to myself, well, I've obviously done the work, why do I need to report on it? But actually visibility is super key within my industry. So even though it's not something that I enjoy, I spend a lot of time making sure that all my stakeholders are informed about what it is that I'm doing, so that I can bring them on the journey with me, which is super, super critical. And it wasn't something that I was born with. It wasn't a skill that I was naturally good at, but I've had to learn to nurture that along the way. And it's the same with Emma. She says, you know, she wants to be involved in all of the design, the print side of things, but she's like, I have a great team that is able to do that, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I do have to be in a lot of the operational side of things, because actually that's where my skill sets are super needed within these organizations. So I really do appreciate the candid nature in which Emma talks about this, and she gives the reality of this being her day-to-day throughout her entire career, whether that was at her internship, whether that was at her paper round, getting up 4 or 5 in the morning painfully to go and do that. But what she does say is how you do one thing is how you do everything. So what you see is that tenacity that she had then, and doing a job to its higher standard, she then keeps that on throughout her career, which is great. The second theme that I think she addresses really well is around radical responsibility. She really takes her story by the bootstraps and says, I don't want to be here, I want to get to A. How do I make this possible? And she's always driving towards that. And a key part of that is introspection. She is able to share a story that she's not proud of, in which she's not able to keep a hold of her anger, and how she was able to access group therapy, which was on the more affordable end of her life in London, and be able to work on her anger, because she realised that actually she wouldn't be getting far if she was going to let her temper get the best of her. Now, she gives herself grace to say, hang on a second, I wasn't role modelled any other way when I was younger, but I knew that I had to take responsibility for it. And she spends years in this group therapy and then now does solo therapy. What I love that she's able to do is A, identify things, B, take responsibility for things, and C, make sure she actions things even when it's uncomfortable for her. And this really sets her apart as a professional and puts her in good stead for her career. And actually, when you see a lot of Emma, she's actually quite vivacious and happy and full of energy. And actually, it was surprising to hear how much she's had to tailor and nurture that throughout her career. She's done a fantastic job of that. And this is one of the areas that she excels in, and she continues to work on those areas that she's weaker in, but does it with a lot of grace and without constantly beating herself up for it. But also, she doesn't let her circumstance be an excuse for her not to work on those areas of development. And how I would boil that down is choosing her hard. Emma always chooses the hard, in which she has to work on herself and doesn't kick the can down the road, which enables her to really succeed at a very, very young age. And touching on that point, she's also someone that is very adaptable, and she is always open to new things. She really embraces AI and the world of tech, and she is always saying how she is keeping herself up to date with these skills, which is a real eye-opener into seeing how she has kept both Skims and Good America really, really successful and relevant, because what she's done is not buried her head in the sand about the change that's coming. She's really looking at how to leverage those things into her business and make it even more relevant. She's really good at understanding what the key unlock of her businesses are. So for Skims, it's to be able to have clothes that fit folks universally, whether that be underwear or ski clothes. She's indiscriminate about it. And if the next trend was about having virtual assistants and giving them a virtual body and dressing them, Emma would be straight onto that. So her tale really is about adaptability. The other thing that she's great at doing is talking about her mistakes, but not letting those define her, and still having the same level of confidence. She talks a lot about how her mum told her that no one is better than her, but she's also not better than anyone else. So when she makes mistakes, she just sees it as, oh, that's a data point and I've learned from that. And that is something that we say, even when you make a mistake on your CV or you get rejected for a role, not taking things personally is something that Emma seems to be great at throughout her career. And she realizes actually that the agency setup is not quite right for the market. She's able to just see this as a data point and then pivot into a whole new industry. She's also then able to use her connections from that agency to then pivot onto looking and working with the Kardashians. She didn't think she was too good to work with reality show celebrities, which at the time were seen in the early 90s and noughties as something slightly tacky and not interesting, people that were famous for being famous. Now we have the whole influencer market that has grown through the invent of YouTube and Instagram and TikTok. But at the time, it was actually quite revolutionary to look at these individuals who were celebrity for the sake of celebrity as a standalone brand and really work and leverage with them. She then uses her own network, that being her partner, to then make him the CEO of one of their apparel businesses. So what this shows is Emma is really willing to put her money where her mouth is. She really doesn't see herself as too good or too beneath anyone, and really sees everyone as their equals. And that has really paid off in the modern market, because now she's able to have two of the most successful apparel brands in the business. What I also love about Emma is that she is able to talk about business and money, and she's really curious on her podcast. The other thread that I think is super important is that Emma addresses the fact that women do not talk a lot about money. And I think one of the nuanced things about this is that we are encouraged not to do that from a British standpoint, because some of that is baked into some of our contracts. And it's not that we're not willing to do that, it's that we are forced into those situations. But actually, there are fewer seats at the table for women, so it makes it seem like it's them versus us. And I think it's easier for men because 8 or 9 positions on the table are for men. So they are more willing to have the conversation and support because they know if it's not that seat, it's another seat. Whereas for women, because there's always a worry that actually there's only 1 or 2 seats there and we don't want to be missing out. But what I have been really lucky is that within my own network, we are having those very transparent conversations, and it's allowing for a much more successful tier of women because we're able to understand what the market is saying. What we're able to understand is where we're being underpaid or what salaries we should be asking for, how much we should be really negotiating in the real world. So it's a big tick that she actually addresses this. Now, one of the nuanced pieces of conversation is that Emma says we shouldn't really be focused on our appearance, and as women we shouldn't be talking too much about our appearance within the workplace. But studies have shown that people that are deemed more attractive are more likely to get paid more or more likely to get a role because they're seen as more competent because of this halo effect. Studies have also shown that people that are more attractive are treated better at work than their stereotypically non-attractive peers. I think it's also not just the women's job not to do this. I think actually this is a case that men have to really be involved in that too, and that we're looking at people based on their skill sets. And one of the ways that we can address this, and maybe this is where technology helps us, is that AI is able to look at people's skill sets rather than just looking at their appearance to make sure that they are hot. And one way we could do that is using AI to help hire rather than having people interview face to face where subconscious bias takes place. So Emma doesn't really address this, and what she says in the book is that actually we shouldn't be talking about our appearance because it depreciates the value that we bring from a skill set perspective. But one of the benefits of doubt that I do want to give her here is that if there were more pages to talk about all of this, Emma would have a much more nuanced argument around this and how to resolve it too. Understand that there are only so many words that you can have from a word count perspective for a book, especially someone who's launching their first book. So it might be something for her to address later down the line. The second area of controversy is regarding privilege. Now, Emma spends a lot of the book talking about radical responsibility and pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. But one of the things that I think she may mention in the book, or definitely does in her interviews, is that her partner Jens ends up being one of the first investors in her first initial company. Now, this allows her a set of privileges and understanding about the business world that most people aren't. Because at this point he's a serial entrepreneur, she's able to benefit from his resources, that being capital, but also his relationships, his intelligence and IP. All of these things are inputs that she is able to leverage that she wouldn't have if she was just, say, an East London girl. This is something that she wouldn't be able to have access to if she was a single mother, say, in East London. But what Emma would argue is that she'd worked really hard to be in these jobs and that she'd positioned herself to be able to have access to Jens, who then later invests in her business. And I think the initial stages they weren't husband and wife. But then this plays into the narrative of how our appearance can subconsciously give us an advantage over our other peers. And I don't think Emma really ever truly addresses this. I think she just says it's her grit and her hard work and her skill that enables her to get there, which she does denote at some stages is down to her husband investing in her business prior to them having a relationship. We never really get to talk about the underbelly of that, and I think that's an interesting point. That being said, what I think is super transparent about Emma is that she is always very open about the type of relationship she has around her, whether that be romantic or friendships or business. She's always thinking about being around people that are evenly yoked. So whilst she never addresses it in the book, I do think that Jens's business prowess probably played an element into her wanting to settle down with this person. And this also leads on to the fact that Emma really is so vulnerable and open about encouraging women at a younger age, even if it's tricky in some sense to have children or think about freezing their eggs. What Emma is able to show is if you really do want a lifelong goal of having a family, and it's okay if you don't, but if you do, think about how to prioritize that because it may take longer than you think. So it's super important that you factor that into your working life as you would do with a partner. And further to that point, what Emma has done really well is picked a partner like Jens who comes from a Scandinavian background in which they do childcare 50-50. And throughout the book, Emma is really transparent about the fact that she doesn't interfere too much when Jens is doing solo parenting, and she gives him the space to do that, which which I think is brilliant. But the other thing that I wish she had done is a bit like when she talks about women overplaying appearance within the workplace. She doesn't really hold to account the governments or the businesses not allowing the flexibility to be able to do childcare really, really well. Because the reason why companies are not as flexible around childcare is because they think if we're super flexible, then that gives a competitive advantage to company X, Y, and Z who are competitors, and actually it's not beneficial. But actually, if there are rules and regulations around this from a government or country perspective or a European market perspective, then actually what you find is everyone is acting under the same rules, and this allows flexibility for childcare within the workforce. So what would have been really useful is for Emma to encourage women and men alike to really campaign within their companies to have this level of flexibility and freedom, especially when folks are in the phase of bringing up a young family. And what I think is sad is that the media hasn't taken a lot of time, because of this kick-rake society that we're in, is to advocate when Emma says, it's taken a village, I haven't done this on my own, it's taken an army to get me here. And that includes her partner and the flexibility that she's had within the workforce. So I think that this has added fuel to the fire and backlash against Emma. The other area of heat that Emma's gotten is about her being a 3-hour mum. And I think there are multiple lanes to have this conversation in. So I think one of the things that people are overlooking is if you are a working mum, taking a couple of hours traveling in and out of work, your 8 hours of sleep, an hour of eating, and that includes all 3 of your meals. So let's say you wolf them down in 20 minutes each, plus your hour of working out, plus the half an hour it will take you to go there, etc., and the half an hour it takes you to shower, you are probably left with about 2 to 3 hours in the evening with your child. But I think what people find really frustrating is that actually she would have had access to childcare, whether that be a nanny or a nursery, or her partner having flexible working as he's an entrepreneur. So I think people want to address the fact that she has the advantage of doing that. But the reality is most working parents only have those hours with their kids. But the main frustration is that even if they wanted to have more time with those children, or even to have those 3 hours, they're having to pay a significant fee to be able to get just basic and adequate care. And I know that in other interviews, Emma has been really transparent about her mum not having access to this, and therefore Emma herself having to be a parent-child. But this is not the gold standard that we want to have for our children. And in Emma radically accepting this truth, which she thinks is a reasonable payoff for being able to build these multi-million pound or dollar businesses, she riles up all of the other folks who are saying, actually, we're having to do this just to survive. You're electing to do this, Emma, because you want to have these really cool businesses that are really affluent, but we're having to do this out of necessity to just pay for our own bills, etc. And I think their frustration is, as someone who's come from that background, for her not to acknowledge that this is something that not a significant number of people would want, is I think where the tension lies. So it would have been helpful to say, it might be necessity driving you to be away from your children. Frustrating that our governments haven't set up a infrastructure that allows you to be home if you want to. She almost glamorizes it, but I think it's actually her radical acceptance of this which allows her to do it. And also she has the privilege of a nanny to know that she's not just sending her child to a reception where some parents believe that their children are not getting that adequate one-on-one care which her children do benefit from. So I think this is really to do with the framing and not just the reality of what most working mums face. And this is also tied into the working from home discussion. And I think this is also tied into the working from home discussion, which a lot of mums have to do from an affordability perspective. Emma really looks down on that. And I think this is where the controversy lies, that most of these organizations, say from a supplier perspective or from a design perspective, they're willing to outsource a lot of their production into the likes of China, where it takes days and days for them to go and produce these things and for those things to be shipped out into the rest of the world. They're willing to make those sacrifices because from a cost perspective, this makes more sense for them. Yet they're not willing to give that flexibility to their workforce and not willing to write off some of the inconveniences, because essentially a lot of it does come to visibility and control within these organizations. And so for Emma not to advocate for this when she's happy to do some of the outsourcing for when it suits the business is where I think a lot of the tension lies. within this discourse. And working from home does allow a lot of flexibility for working mums, because it does mean that they can go to the gym during their lunch break or beforehand, because they're not having to do an hour or two of commuting. It means that they can food prep healthier food for their families. But of course, we know that when these companies outsource their production of their clothing or products to China, we know that the working conditions are a lot stricter, even in the nicest of factories. And so I think that leadership are willing to pay that off, because they know that the productivity doesn't suffer in those organizations, whereas they're worried about that being an issue within the Western world. And it's this imbalance that we need to really address. You really also need to address the moral argument of, when these production lines are made in the eastern part of the world, are we okay to have such stringent rules for these workers, especially if they're conditions that we wouldn't accept in the West? One of the other difficult themes that Emma tackles is around running her organization, and two things really strike. So that's around making tough decisions around redundancies. Emma doesn't beat herself up around having to make cost decisions related to her business. And what she does well is say, actually, men also have to make these decisions. As a woman, just because I'm having to also make these decisions doesn't make me a horrible person. I have a lot more empathy than a typical man would. It doesn't mean that I can't make these decisions and that I'm a bad person for having made these decisions. So again, this touches on Emma's ability to not let her actions and feelings define her output. And I think she tackles that theme really well. And tied to that is Emma's ability to give really direct feedback. And I love that she is not worried about the negative pushback she might get on social media for having an opinion, for acting a certain way. She says throughout work, she's really clear about what her expectations are, when she does like something, when she doesn't like something. And I think this is very much that East London directness that she talks about. And I think actually within Britain and the Western world, we could do a lot more of that, rather than saying, I love this, I like that, and then turning around and then dismissing someone. She's actually really transparent about that, which I think a lot of leaders, both men and women, can take away, which I think is fantastic. And of course, one of the other brilliant things that Emma does well is around branding. And she doesn't really talk about this within the book, but she's really authentic in the book with her voice. You can really hear her speaking through the text. The other thing she's done really well is she's launched her podcast. She's also gone on a lot of podcasts and mainstream media to really tell her story. But it's really taken her, 15, 20 years to get there. And what I think she does is show the sausage making of it. And she talks about all of the unglamorous sides of it. And I think that is what makes her a really good leader, and also someone who's a powerful storyteller. She's great at engaging and building relationships with folks. And you see it in real time through her books, but also in the way that she interviews people, and when she's interviewed, how she speaks to the journalists, etc. So I think she's first in class for that. So overall, I really enjoyed the book. I think there are some really good takeaways around taking responsibility, working hard, having the tenacity to do things, not letting rejection get to you, seeing yourself as an equal in the workforce, and not really caring about what other people think. She says, no one watches you as closely as you watch yourself, which I think is really powerful. But there are, of course, controversial things around working from home and privilege, which I think requires a more nuanced conversation, and the high standards in which we have for ourselves. And it's not that I don't agree with Emma. I do think being in the office and having that visibility does allow you to make decisions quicker. And there are certain preferences people in the modern world do get because they're in the office and their work is a lot more visible. In consulting, they used to call it floor walking. And it is easier when someone's in the office to see that work. But that means if you are working from home, that you are reporting a lot more on the work that you do, that your camera's on when you're on a Zoom call, that you are constantly updating folks about what you're doing via pings, via meetings, via emails, so that you're constantly in folks' mind. And the other thing, if you do want to work from home, possessing really hot in demand skills that make you undeniable subject matter expert will mean that you can do a lot of remote working, because your skill sets are key and crucial for the company. And that's why a lot of these very techie people, and it used to be that it was software engineers and coders, they used to be able to work remotely because their skill set was so in demand that people were willing to be as flexible as they could could be to make things work and to have that skill set within their organization. So if Emma was to be able to address these, I think would be super, super useful. But Emma's book is really about herself and what she values as a leader and how she's grown successful in the world. And that's her advice. And to expect her to give advice, anything contrary to what she's experienced or what she has seen, may be a bit of a stretch. But all in all, would highly recommend. And let me know in the comment section what other books you'd like me to review. Thank you. And I'll see you on the next one. And do subscribe for more. Bye.